Henry Jameson sat alone in the booth by the window of a roadside diner, the afternoon sun slicing through dusty blinds and settling in bright, uneven patches on the worn Formica tabletop. He took a slow breath, savoring the quiet hum of the place. At 88 years old, each movement he made was deliberate, as though he understood that life had turned into a careful balancing act of conserving energy and preserving dignity. He had learned long ago not to rush. Even turning his head to glance outside carried a certain weight. He moved at his own pace, unhurried, as if time itself would stretch a little longer for him. His face bore the deep etchings of a life spent witnessing too many storms, both literal and figurative. Faint scars and countless wrinkles mapped out a journey through years that most could only imagine. There was a heaviness around his eyes, a subtle hint of old grief and quiet pride. He had seen wars come and go, friendships forged and lost, and the slow forgetting of battles that once consumed the entire world's attention. He'd been a soldier, standing in far-off fields when he was barely more than a boy, learning to survive against odds that seemed insurmountable. Now the world had moved on from those days, letting them gather dust in history books and faded photographs. Henry, however, carried them with him in the set of his jaw and the careful way he regarded strangers. Today he wore a neatly pressed shirt, pale blue cotton, crisp at the collar, and trousers that still held a sharp crease. A simple leather belt, polished shoes, and a faint scent of aftershave completed the picture of a man who refused to surrender to the untidiness of age. Perhaps he did this not only for himself, but also to honor the memory of those who had not lived to see a fitful old age. He had learned that life, for all its chaos, gained meaning through small acts of self-respect, and so he dressed each morning with care, even if the world seemed too loud, too fast, too eager to overlook someone of his years. Beyond the diner's window, the old highway stretched out, its asphalt cracked in places and shimmering faintly in the late afternoon heat. Dry fields unrolled on either side, dotted with shrubs and tufts of hardy grass that had learned to survive under a relentless sun. Farther in the distance, gentle hills rose and fell, their contours blurred by a haze that danced at the edges of vision. A few cars passed by intermittently, their engines a muted chorus that reminded Henry that life went on, even in this quiet corner of the country. In the parking lot, several cars huddled close to the diner's entrance, their paint dulled by dust from the road. One stood apart, a single motorcycle whose chrome details caught the sunlight and hurled it back in dazzling shards. Something about that lone bike gave Henry pause. It was a machine built for speed and swagger, its polished body both beautiful and faintly threatening. The sky above was a stretch of unbroken blue, not a cloud in sight, as if nothing could possibly disturb this moment of stillness. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was one of gentle routines and comforting presence. The waitress, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and hair tied up in a loose bun, moved between tables with a soft hum under her breath. Now and then she offered Henry a small smile, as if acknowledging the quiet respect that filled the space around him. A couple sat at the counter, heads close together, murmuring softly about mundane things, chores, weekend plans, a neighbor's new dog. Their voices were low and warm, reminding Henry of a world that could still be gentle despite all he had seen. Henry appreciated these small comforts with a gratitude he did not always find the words to express. He had ventured here for a simple pleasure, a slice of lemon pie, and maybe another cup of coffee. Perhaps he would let his mind wander back to a time when he was a younger man, when he still believed the world could be easily understood. He might recall the laughter of old friends, the bright uniforms, the clatter of boots on foreign soil, and the days when he had held a rifle with trembling hands. He could think of that now without bitterness, only a lingering sadness that the world forgot too quickly. As he lifted his coffee cup for a measured sip, he caught a glimpse of movement at the corner of his eye. The door swung open with more force than usual, sending a bell jangling overhead. He could feel, rather than see, the sudden shift in energy. Heavy boots thudded against the linoleum. Voices, loud, brash, and carrying an undercurrent of challenge, floated into the calm interior like a discordant note in a gentle melody. A gang of bikers trudged in, bringing with them a scent of leather, sweat, and road dust. They filled the space with their presence immediately, as if the diner belonged to them. There was laughter, but not the kind that came from genuine amusement. It had an edge, a taunting quality that made the waitress hesitate and the couple at the counter straighten a bit. Henry lowered his cup, his eyes drifting toward the reflection in the window. He could see their shapes behind him, big and confident, taking up room without apology. It happened in an instant. The peaceful rhythm of the diner faltered. The humming waitress quieted. The couple paused mid-conversation, and the subtle layer of comfort thinned to near transparency. Henry's shoulders tensed, but only slightly. He had felt this kind of tension before, in different settings, under different skies. It was the feeling that preceded confrontation, the quiet before a storm. He understood that sometimes trouble arrived without warning or reason. He did not turn around immediately. Instead, he let the moment stretch, listening closely to the tone of their voices, the shuffle of their boots against the floor, and the way one of them tapped knuckles on a tabletop, as if claiming territory. Henry's heart sank a notch. He had come here to remember simpler times, to find a modicum of peace. Now fate had placed these strangers in his path. Age had taught him that not every conflict could be avoided simply by remaining quiet. Still, he tried to stay calm. He kept his posture straight, his gaze steady. The afternoon sun still slanted through the dusty blinds, painting him in warm light, and he clung to that warmth as if it could shield him from what was to come. The glint of the motorcycle's chrome outside felt suddenly ominous, as if reflecting the spark of discord that had entered the diner. Henry breathed in slowly. He had faced adversity before, and he knew fear could be managed, tamed into cautious resolve. He reminded himself that he was no longer young, no longer swift, but he still had his pride, his wits, and a lifetime of experience etched into his very bones. He set the coffee cup down, the ceramic making a soft click against the tabletop. The bikers' laughter swelled for a moment, their boots shifting as they spread out, surveying their surroundings like predators assessing new ground. In that instant, Henry realized he would need to stay alert. He would not shrink out trouble, and if it came to him, he would not shrink away. He waited, quiet as the fields outside, steady as the old hills in the distance, preparing himself for whatever change the shifting air had promised. The gang invaded the diner's hush like wolves entering a clearing, their presence a violent chord struck in the midst of a peaceful melody. 6 of them in total. Rough men in leather jackets adorned with snarling wolf heads and flaming skulls. Patches and pins that hinted at past conflicts and loyalty. They were all tall and broad, their boots heavy, leaving slow, deliberate footprints on the worn linoleum. Someone stalked right into my bones. My skull is burning, though I can't feel the pain. I can feel it. The air grew thick with the smell of cigarettes and unwashed denim, with a hint of stale beer lingering around them like a personal signature. Henry watched from the corner of his vision, not daring to turn his head too far. He caught glimpses. One man with a hawkish nose and beady eyes, another with tattoos crawling like vines around his neck. But it was their leader who commanded the space most powerfully, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar twisting across his left cheek, as though someone long ago had tried to carve a lesson into his flesh and failed. His leather jacket bore the largest emblem, a snarling beast's head with crimson eyes. He paused by the entrance, surveying the patrons one by one, a butcher sizing up cuts of meat. The waitress, who had been in mid-pour for another customer's coffee, froze with the pot suspended in mid-air. Her mouth parted slightly, words trapped behind her teeth. The couple at the counter went silent, the man pulling his arm protectively around his companion's shoulders. A few other guests, who moments before had been absorbed in their own quiet routine, suddenly became statues, as if their stillness could erase them from the biker's line of sight. Henry could feel all this without looking directly. The atmosphere had changed in a heartbeat. The diner's warm hush replaced by a tension that vibrated in the floors and walls. He focused on his coffee, tried to remain invisible. If he could have sunk into the vinyl upholstery of his booth and vanished, he might have done so. He lifted his mug, careful, attempting to steady his trembling hand. Despite his years of training himself not to flinch, not to show fear, the slight rattle of the porcelain betrayed him. He cursed inwardly at that faint sound, as subtle as a whisper but loud enough in this charged silence. A quick glance upward confirmed his growing suspicion. The leader's gaze had locked onto him. Something in Henry's posture, or perhaps his age, had drawn their attention like moths to a flame. An old man, alone, probably seemed like the easiest kind of prey. Someone who wouldn't fight back, who would cower and plead. Henry's heart clenched at the thought. He had once faced enemies who carried rifles, who knew how to aim and how to kill. Yet here he sat, decades later, confronted by men who likely knew nothing of real war, only the cheap imitation of violence and intimidation. Henry tried to recall the calming techniques he'd used back in those distant days. Breathe slowly, evenly. Remember that fear, once recognized, can be tamed. He knew better than to make eye contact now, knew it could be seen as a challenge or an invitation. Instead, he stared into the depths of his coffee as if it were a mirror. He tried to think of the fields he had once stood in, the open skies, the murmured jokes shared in the barracks, but the present moment's gravity pulled him back, each second thickening the tension. The leader began to move, crossing the small distance from the door to Henry's booth with a leisurely stride. His boots thumped on the floor in a calculated rhythm, each step chosen to announce dominance. He took his time, perhaps relishing the fear he believed he would find. Henry caught sight of him now in the periphery, the scar, the heavy brow, the way his knuckles tightened and loosened, eager for something to break. Henry's muscles coiled involuntarily. He was old, yes, but his reflexes weren't entirely gone. He felt the blood running warmer through his veins. Not anger. He had outgrown hot anger long ago. No. What he felt was a kind of quiet determination. He had come here today for a piece of pie and a bit of peace. Instead, he had been offered a confrontation he hadn't sought. He wanted to believe it could still be diffused, that these men would tire of their game and move on, but as the leader loomed closer, Henry knew the look he carried too well, the look of a man who needed to prove something, to himself or to his followers, at any cost. The gang fanned out behind their leader, forming a loose semicircle. One took up a spot near the jukebox, arms crossed, daring anyone to move past him. Another sidled closer to the waitress, who instinctively backed away, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. The couple at the counter clung to each other, eyes downcast. Henry felt a surge of protectiveness for these strangers. He did not know them, but he knew fear and what it did to good people. He had seen it in every corner of the world, fear rendering humans silent, compliant, helpless. The leader stopped a foot away from Henry's table. Henry could feel the man's gaze, hot and scrutinizing, as if searching for a crack in the old man's facade. When Henry finally dared to lift his eyes just a fraction, he found the leader smiling. A slow, predatory curl of the lips that revealed no warmth. The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "Enjoying your coffee, old man?" he asked, voice low and gravelly. He let the question hang in the air, challenging Henry to respond. There was a mocking lilt to it, a suggestion that no matter what Henry said, the gang would twist it into a reason to push further. Henry cleared his throat softly, careful not to seem too confident, nor too meek. He simply nodded, then lifted his mug and took a small sip. It was an act of defiance and a show of calm, however forced it might have been. The porcelain still rattled slightly against his teeth, and Henry hoped the biker didn't notice. Or, if he did, that he'd mistake it for nothing more than the jitters of old age. Henry would play into their assumptions if it kept him a step ahead. The leader chuckled, a low rumble that stirred the stagnant air. Behind him, the others shifted like restless animals. Henry's mind raced. Should he speak or remain silent? Words, if chosen poorly, could escalate things. Silence, however, might be read as weakness. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to remember who he was. Once he had been a young man in a uniform, pressed by fear and duty into places he never thought he'd survive. He had learned then that strength often came disguised as composure. He would not plead or panic. He would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing him break. So he met the leader's gaze with a measured look, neither challenging nor retreating. A faint tremor still coursed through him, the body's honest admission that danger loomed. He accepted that fear, acknowledging it silently, then trying to let it pass through him like a gust of cold wind. He would remain steady if he could. All around the diner, tension climbed with each breath. The waitress took a small step back toward the kitchen, eyes darting between Henry and the gang. The couple at the counter seemed to shrink as if trying to disappear. The other patrons, if any remained, were likely doing the same. It was just Henry and these bikers now, locked in a silent contest. They wanted to provoke him, to see if he would flinch or beg. Instead, he took another slow sip, the warmth of the coffee soothing his dry throat. Deep inside, he felt regret pressing against his ribs. This was supposed to be a quiet afternoon of memories and simple pleasures. But life, he knew, rarely followed the path of least resistance. He steadied himself and waited, not knowing yet how he would find his way out, but certain that no easy escape would present itself. Still, he would have to rely on the lessons life had taught him, patience, courage, and the understanding that even if the world saw him as an old man, he carried within him the resolve of one who had already survived some of humanity's darkest hours. Henry could feel the leader's breath as the man leaned in, catching the faint, oily tang of the aftershave that did more to mask than eliminate the smell of sweat and old smoke. The diner's muted light caught on the biker's scar, making it stand out like a jagged reminder of past violence. Henry kept his eyes level, refusing to shrink back. His heart drummed in his chest, but his face remained calm, as if carved from weathered stone. From the edge of his vision, he saw one of the other bikers flick a glance toward the window, checking if anyone outside might be watching. Another circled slowly toward the booths near the back, shifting the weight of his booths with deliberate menace. With each small movement they made, the diner's atmosphere tightened. Henry could sense the fear of the other patrons, the silent desperation that comes from the belief that this confrontation would dissolve without violence. The waitress hovered near the kitchen door, her silhouette trembling slightly. She looked as though she wanted to call for help, but was afraid to draw attention. Henry understood that fear. He had seen it countless times, on the faces of frightened villagers, of new recruits bracing for gunfire. Fear could paralyze, or it could ignite defiance. He considered his words carefully. He did not wish to provoke them, but neither would he submit to their cruelty. "I'm just having coffee," he'd said, and he stood by that truth. Yet they wanted more. They wanted him to show weakness, to flinch, to beg for mercy that they would withhold. The leader's eyes, narrowed and shining with mean satisfaction, waited for a crack in Henry's resolve. Outside, a car passed on the old highway, its engine rumbling faintly. It might have been a traveler bound for some distant town, unaware of the tension inside this unremarkable diner. Henry pictured that traveler. Someone enjoying an uneventful drive, maybe humming along to a radio tune, and felt a pang of envy for their ignorance. He was here, trapped in a moment that might bend toward violence. His mind cast back through the decades to another time, another standoff, when he'd been young and everything had been at stake. He remembered how he'd felt then, equal parts terror and resolve. He felt it now, too, though his bones were older and his strength diminished. The leader crushed the sugar packet until granules spilled onto the tabletop like spilled salt after a bad omen. "You don't belong here," he repeated, voice even harsher. His companions closed in, tightening the noose around Henry's sanctuary of calm. Henry let silence linger for a breath. He wanted the man to realize that intimidation alone would not force him to plead or run. Quiet resolve gathered in Henry's chest. He thought of the values he'd fought for, the sacrifices made by his comrades, and the generations that had followed, living freer lives. He might not be able to best a gang of young thugs in brute force anymore, but he understood something they didn't. True courage had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with will. They would learn that if they pressed him. He decided to speak again, just enough to show he would not be broken by insults. "It's a public diner," he said, voice steady. His tone carried a hint of steel, as if reminding them that no one had the right to claim these tables and chairs as personal territory. "I have every right to be here." He watched the leader's lip curl, saw the knuckles of another biker's hand tighten around the back of a chair. The tension thickened. Henry caught the waitress's eyes for an instant. She seemed on the verge of rushing to the phone, maybe to call the police. But fear glued her feet to the floor. Henry almost wished she would run, lock herself in the kitchen, do something to keep safe. He needed no audience if things were to turn ugly. One of the bikers, a lanky fellow with a patchy beard, muttered something under his breath. The leader didn't look away from Henry. He wanted a reaction, anger, panic, anything. Instead, Henry gave him calm, offered no apology for his presence. He sat a bit straighter, remembering the posture drilled into him by stern instructors so many decades ago. His spine might ache, but he held his chauffeur in his eyes. The memory of hostile nights and distant gunfire hummed beneath his skin, not as a terror now, but as a reminder that he had survived worse than this. Seconds passed. The leader's nostrils flared. He had expected easy compliance. Who was this old man who dared to resist with quiet dignity? The biker sneered, leaning even closer, as though challenging Henry to push back. "And what if I say you don't?" he asked softly, voice dripping with threat. "What if I say this is our place now?" Henry's pulse hammered, but he answered with an even gaze. He thought of all the times he had remained steady under pressure, the nights hunkered in trenches, waiting for dawn. The times he had lost friends, forced to go on living and find meaning afterward. This moment, while frightened, did not erase who he was, what he had stood for. He was not going to hand over his dignity because some bully demanded it. He did not reply with words now, choosing silence as a form of strength. Let the biker see it in his face, that he would not be cowed. Behind them, the diner's hush intensified, broken only by the creak of a distant hinge and the muffled hum of a refrigerator. The other bikers shuffled, uncertain. Perhaps they had expected Henry to crumble by now, to offer apologies or try to slip away. Instead, he remained, solid as an old oak tree that refused to bow beneath a passing storm. The leader's eyes narrowed. He might lash out physically next, or he might try another tactic. Henry braced himself for whatever came next. He was not reckless. He knew the danger. But he also knew that surrendering to bullies only fed their cruelty. If they wanted to push him, they would find him more resilient than they imagined. In the growing silence, Henry's heartbeat sounded like distant drum beats in his ears. He wondered if the waitress would call for help, if any other patron might dare intervene. He did not expect it. The burden lay on him now. He, the old soldier who had learned that sometimes you must stand firm, even if you stand alone. The leader seemed to sense this shift. He had come expecting prey, and instead found quiet resistance. Uncertainty flickered across his scarred face. Henry remained still, waiting. He would not strike first. That was never his way, but he would run. They would learn, if it came to that, what true resolve looked like. They would learn that age and grace could carry a strength that no gang patch or harsh words could easily topple. Henry breathed in slowly, the stale tobacco and aftershave filling his lungs. He would remember this moment, no matter how it ended, as one more chapter in a long life of facing the darkness, unafraid. The tension crackled like static in the stale diner air, each second tightening the invisible wires strung between the occupants. Henry felt the weight of it pressing into his chest, constricting his lungs with every breath. He noticed how the other customers shifted, some sliding off their stools, drifting toward the door as if proximity to an exit might shield them from the ugliness brewing in this once peaceful place. A pair of travelers in a corner booth exchanged worried glances, torn between flight and some faint loyalty to the old man holding his ground. Yet no one stepped in. Henry did not blame them. He knew that in moments like this, fear could turn good people into spectators. He heard the leader's mocking voice again, saw the way the man's eyes narrowed with cruel satisfaction as he referenced Henry's past. How had he noticed? Perhaps the glint of that old service ring, a small circle of metal that told a story of duty and sacrifice, had caught the biker's eye. Or maybe it was Henry's posture, that subtle stiffness in his spine that hinted at training long since completed, but never truly forgotten. The biker's question, spat out in a voice dripping with contempt, raked over Henry's nerves. "What'd you do, Grandpa? Play soldier?" Memories welled up, swift and sharp. He saw faces of friends now gone, their voices echoing in distant fields. He tasted the grit of foreign soil, felt the chill of midnight patrols. He remembered how raw fear had once been his companion, how he'd carried on out of love for the men beside him, and for a future he believed deserved protection. The weight of those memories pressed against his heart, but he did not let it show. Instead, he swallowed, letting a brief silence fall. The gang's laughter rose, an ugly chorus that marred the diner's quiet decorum. They fed on each other's bravado, mocking the very idea of service and sacrifice. Henry's jaw tightened. They were free to behave like jackals, precisely because men like him had once stood in harm's way. He refused to feel shame or fear. These bikers could laugh at his age, belittle his past, but they could not rewrite what he had done, nor could they erase who he was. He straightened his shoulders, careful and deliberate, as if realigning his spirit as well as his spine. Then he spoke, voice low and firm, every syllable weighted with the truth of his life. "I served my country, no more, no less." He did not need to justify or elaborate. The words stood as solid facts that required no apology. For an instant, a hush threatened to fall. The gang wanted a target who would crumble, not someone who dared to meet them with quiet, unwavering pride. Their surprise curdled quickly into renewed hostility. One of them stepped closer, a man with angry, bloodshot eyes and a sneer carved into his lips. Before Henry could shift his stance, the biker jabbed him hard in the shoulder. Pain flared, not overwhelming but sharp enough to ignite anger deep within Henry's chest. But Henry did not yield. He clenched his teeth, fighting down an urge to flinch or bring a hand up to the sore spot. He had felt far worse injuries in his time, wounds that left lasting scars, both visible and invisible. This was nothing compared to the burdens he had carried. He remained still, his gaze steady on the gang, letting them know that a shove or a punch would not break him. Inside Henry, something stirred. A quiet strength, long dormant, rose up in answer to their cruelty. He remembered the lessons of combat, not just the tactics and physical endurance, but the understanding that true power often lay in self-patrol. These bullies were accustomed to easy victories. They terrorized those who would quail and run. Yet Henry stood firm, forcing them to confront the unsettling truth that their intimidation might not work this time. He could almost sense their confusion. The leader, scar and all, had expected a cringing old man, perhaps tears or pleas. Instead, he found defiance. Henry's calm unsettled them more than if he had shouted or cursed. His presence was a silent rebuke, a reminder that while they had chosen violence and ridicule, he had chosen a path that demanded courage and sacrifice. In a fair world, that would carry weight. But in this moment, surrounded by sneering faces, Henry understood that decency might not sway them. Yet he also sensed a crack in their armor of confidence. If they had been certain of themselves before, their certainty now wavered. They were not dealing with a frail victim. They were dealing with someone who had known terror more profound than their petty threats. A man who had watched life and death dance in cruel embrace and still emerged with his humanity intact. Henry's shoulder throbbed, but the pain was distant, a minor inconvenience. He allowed himself a small, steadying breath. The diner's silence deepened, except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan and the rustle of clothing as patrons tried to shrink unnoticed into their seats. The waitress hovered by the kitchen door, her eyes wide with fear and concern. She wanted to help, perhaps, but did not know how. Henry did not blame her. This was not a movie scene where someone would come rushing in at the perfect moment to save the day. He would have to handle this himself, drawing on wells of strength built over decades. He refused to be their victim. He might not be able to subdue a gang physically. That was a question he did not want to answer, but he could maintain his dignity, his composure, and his sense of right and wrong. To lose those would be a defeat more bitter than any bruise. The leader eyed him, anger simmering in his gaze. He had mocked Henry's military past, tried to strip him of pride, but all he had done was summon something timeless within Henry's soul. Henry knew fear, yes, but he also knew how to walk through it. The gang wanted to see him cower. Instead, they found him enduring, like an old tree weathering a sudden storm. A subtle shift occurred in the room. Perhaps one of the bikers realized that beating on an 88-year-old man in front of witnesses would not gain them respect. Perhaps another sensed that Henry's stance and calm voice hinted at old skills they shouldn't underestimate. The couple at the counter exchanged a nervous look. One of the other customers, a traveling salesman with tired eyes, cleared his throat softly, as if gathering the courage to say something. He did not speak, but the sound was enough to suggest that not everyone here would remain silently complicit. Henry focused on what he could control, his breathing, his posture, the steady set of his jaw. He had seen men face death without flinching. He could surely face these bullies. He had marched through foreign fields, heard bullets whistle overhead, lost brothers and arms, and yet pressed on. These bikers, for all their bluster, did not come close to the horrors he had witnessed. He would let them see that in his eyes, if nothing else. A trickle of sweat slid down the back of his neck, and he ignored it. The leader drew a breath, perhaps to launch another insult or dare Henry to fight. Henry did not move. He would not give them the reaction they wanted. He would give only truth and courage. His silence, backed by decades of endurance, was more eloquent than any retort he could offer. And so they stood, locked in a quiet standoff, one old man, fueled by memories of a war fought for principles larger than himself, and a gang of younger men, searching for a cheap victory to validate their petty cruelty. Henry did not know how this would end, but he knew who he was. He knew that no matter what they tried, they could not steal the core of him, the values he had bled for, the discipline that had sustained him when everything seemed lost. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but perhaps soon they would learn. A mug of coffee toppled from the table, shattering on the floor, dark liquid spreading across the tiles like a wounded shadow seeping deeper into the silence. The brittle sound of ceramic fragments snapping underfoot jarred the hush that had settled over the diner. A few scattered gasps rose from the onlookers. The bikers sneered at the mess, their faces lit with cruel amusement, as if delighted by this petty show of domination. The waitress stifled a cry, her hand shooting up to her mouth. Henry's jaw clenched, feeling a surge of anger at the fear that shone in her eyes. He loathed seeing good people frightened by bullies. He stood at the center of it all, perched in his booth, but poised like a coiled spring. Each heartbeat pounded in his ears as he watched the bikers revel in their show of force. He had not expected to find himself in such a standoff today, had not asked for this intrusion into his quiet afternoon. Yet, here he was, confronting a band of aggressors for the sake of strangers who shouldn't have to endure such ugliness. It struck him as grimly ironic. He had once traveled halfway around the world to protect innocent lives, and now, decades later, he faced a smaller yet no less meaningful test of will. The leader of the gang loomed closer, fists clenching at his sides. The dim lighting caught the tense lines of his face, his scar contorting as he tightened his jaw. There was no mistaking his intent. He wanted to break Henry's composure, to force a cowering submission or an outburst of panic. "Think you're tough, old man?" he spat, voice crackling in the charged air. Henry's eyes flicked to the waitress. Her shoulders trembled, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. She looked ready to run or sink into the floor. Others in the diner wore the same helpless expression, trapped between their desire to help and their instinct for self-preservation. Henry knew he stood alone in this moment. Expecting intervention would be foolish. These people were bystanders, not trained for conflict, and he couldn't fault them for their fear. He refused to demand courage from those who hadn't been forged in the crucible of war and loss. He pressed his lips together. He could feel the old scars under his shirt, faint reminders of past battles. He remembered the ache in his bones on cold mornings, when his body warned him of storms long before they arrived. Age had softened his muscles, slowed his reflexes. But age had also granted him an unshakable inner core. He might have been slower now, but he was no weaker in spirit. Inside his mind, a distant voice echoed, a stern sergeant from another era, barking orders over the thunder of artillery. When backed into a corner, you stand your ground. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? Standing ground wasn't always about winning a fight. Sometimes it was about showing that you would not be crushed underfoot, that cruelty would not find easy purchase. The spark of courage flickered brighter within him. These men thought an old man's resolve had worn thin with time. They were wrong. He felt the memories of distant battlefields rise in his chest, sleepless nights under foreign skies, the whistle of shells overhead, the guttural cries of wounded friends. He had faced death when he was barely more than a boy, and lived to tell of it. He had learned back then that fear did not banish. One simply learned to dance with it, to push through its paralyzing grip, and act regardless of trembling knees. Henry let out a slow breath and scanned the room for options. He had long ago learned to use what was available. War taught that anything could become a weapon or a shield if you were clever enough. His gaze found a heavy ceramic plate on a nearby table, its chipped edge a testament to many breakfasts served. Not much, but weighty enough to cause a second thought if swung right. Beyond that, he caught sight of a cane leaning discreetly against the wall near the coat rack. It might have belonged to another customer, an older gentleman who had stepped into the restroom, perhaps. Henry noted its sturdy construction. A cane, well wielded, could even the odds by a fraction. He didn't want to start a fight. Violence had already carved its mark on his life. He had left battlefields behind in hopes that people could live in peace. But if these bikers pressed him, if they chose to escalate this from intimidation to harm, he would not hesitate to defend himself and those around him. He knew there was no honor in allowing bullies to trample over the innocent. He said nothing, simply let his silence speak. He kept his posture straight, meeting the leader's glare without blinking. He refused to appear rattled. Sometimes, the courage to stand firm forced aggressors to question their assumptions. He hoped they would see a steeled opponent, not an easy target, and reconsider their course. But the leader snorted, challenging silence with more venom. Henry could practically taste the man's desire to prove himself, to show off to his followers that he could bend this old stranger to his will. The others shuffled, boots scraping the floor, anticipating what might come next. One of them cocked his head toward the cane, as if noticing Henry's glance. Another cracked knuckles loudly, an unsettling percussion in the quiet diner. Henry weighed his options. A single wrong move could ignite the situation. If he reached for the cane too soon, they might interpret it as aggression and swarm him. If he stood abruptly, he might lose the advantage of surprise. If they attacked, he'd have to move quickly, and at his age, speed was not his ally. But he had skill. He remembered the principles of leverage, knew how to strike a knee or deflect a blow. He'd have only seconds to act. to turn the tide or at least ensure he didn't become a casualty in some senseless display of cruelty. He thought again of the waitress and her trembling shoulders, the tears she tried to hold back. He thought of the couple at the counter, clutching each other's hands. He realized that beyond self-preservation, he had another reason to stand firm. These people needed to know that fear did not always win. They needed a reminder that the world still held individuals who would face down bullies. He tightened his hands into fists under the table, knuckles whitening. The pain in his shoulder from the earlier jab lingered, but he absorbed it, let it sharpen his focus rather than dull it. He would endure whatever discomfort came his way if it meant preserving dignity and safety for others. He had done so before, in more brutal circumstances. The leader shifted closer, his boots creaking on the floor, impatience radiating from every tense muscle. Henry felt the pressure rise. Any second now, a spark could fly, and the fragile calm would shatter into chaos. He braced his muscles, prepared his mind. He would give them one last chance to back down, to realize their error. If they persisted, he would show them that even an old man could be formidable when principle and courage burned in his chest. Outside, a distant truck's engine grumbled along the highway, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside the diner's walls. Inside, no one spoke. The waitress stood pinned by her fear, the customers rooted to their seats, and the bikers poised to strike. Henry met the leader's eyes with quiet determination. If there had been any doubt in Henry's mind before, it vanished now. If they forced his hand, he would not hesitate. Not today, not in this diner, not while he still drew breath. The silence stretched taut, and Henry exhaled slowly, as if breathing strength into the room. He had survived worse. He had stood firm against enemies who would have killed him without a second thought. Whatever happened next, he knew this truth. He was not broken, and he would never yield. Henry moved with a fluidity that belied his age. The moment the leader's punch sailed harmlessly by, Henry stepped lightly to the side and positioned himself near a booth. He could feel the rise of adrenaline, a familiar current that crackled through his limbs. Decades had passed since he'd last relied on these instincts, yet they sprang forth as if no time had elapsed, as though the old lessons had been patiently waiting beneath the surface of his calm exterior. The gang's surprise was palpable. They had expected easy compliance, or at least a clumsy, frightened attempt to shield himself. Instead, they found a man who responded with cunning restraint. One of them lunged forward, a blur of leather and clenched fists, and Henry met him not with brute force, but with a small, precise adjustment of his body. The biker's momentum was used against him, a firm defense sending the attackers stumbling off balance. The sound of his boots skidding on the floor seemed thunderous in the hush that followed. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the diner. Henry could sense the disbelief rolling off the onlookers. He could almost taste their fascination and fear. Mingled in the silent air, the waitress stood frozen near the kitchen door, eyes wide, coffee pot trembling in her hand. The couple at the counter, who had been quietly hoping this would all just go away, now exchanged looks of astonishment. Never in their wildest imaginings had they expected the old man to hold his own, much less turn the tide of this encounter. The bikers pressed closer, determined not to lose face in front of each other. Their circle tightened, menacing shadows stretching over the checkerboard floor. Henry inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He was not a seasoned street fighter. He had never sought out conflict. In his youth, he had been trained to handle desperate situations with calm efficiency, and that training had stayed with him. He understood that brute strength mattered less than balance, timing, and the willingness to remain clear-headed under pressure. Panic would be his undoing, so he refused to let it in. Instead, he let his old instincts guide him, a quiet voice in his mind telling him where to step, when to pivot, how to keep his center of gravity low and stable. He caught sight of the cane out of the corner of his eye, a slender piece of polished wood left unattended near the wall. Without hesitation, he reached for it, lifting it and testing its weight. It was solid, heavier than it looked. In another life, it might have been a walking aid or a simple fashion accessory. Today, it was a means of protecting himself. Nothing more, nothing less. A younger biker, lean and eager, decided to make his move. He charged forward, clearly hoping his speed and aggression would shatter Henry's defenses. But Henry saw the move coming, recognized the telltale shift in the biker's stance and shoulders. Before the assailant could close the distance, Henry lifted the cane and rapped it smartly against the man's knee. The impact was controlled, deliberate, a precise strike aimed at a vulnerable spot. The biker let out a sharp yelp, stumbling as pain buckled his leg. He cursed loudly, the sound echoing between the diner's walls. This was not going as the gang had planned. They had stepped into this diner certain they would dominate the scene, that their display of force would be met with fear and surrender. Instead, they were confronted with a man who did not crumble under threats, a man who parried their violence with calm efficiency. Confusion etched into their faces. They glanced at each other, hesitating, as though wordlessly questioning who would risk another attempt. Henry's breathing grew a little labored, the exertion reminding him of his age. A twinge in his shoulder, a heaviness in his legs. These were real enough, but he accepted them without complaint. He hadn't come here to fight. He had wanted only a peaceful afternoon, a cup of coffee, a slice of pie. Yet if fate demanded he use old skills to hold cruelty at bay, he would. He had not endured past wars only to yield now to a handful of thugs. His reason was simple. He would not let them trample on his dignity, nor would he allow them to terrorize these people who had done nothing but mind their own business. The biker's bravado wavered. The leader glared at Henry, anger darkening his features, but beneath that anger lay uncertainty. He had expected the old man to fold, not to stand up and fight back. He clenched his fists, knuckles whitening, as he tried to think of another angle. Meanwhile, the younger man shifted, shuffled his feet, uncertain whether to rush Henry at once or wait for a cue from their leader. The spectators watched, caught between admiration and fear. The waitress, tears glistening at the edges of her eyes, looked torn between wanting to help and not daring to move. Henry offered her a brief, steady glance, a small reassurance if she chose to take it. He was winded, yes, but he had no intention of letting these men see any sign of weakness. He stood straighter, repositioning the cane in his hands with quiet confidence. In the silence that followed, he could almost feel the gang's collective frustration mounting. They had relied on intimidation, yet intimidation alone had failed. They had counted on Henry's frailty, but frailty had not appeared. Instead, they faced a man who responded to threats with surprising courage. Henry himself felt something akin to clarity settling over him, a sense of purpose that he had not felt in years. He was defending more than just himself. He was defending the principle that no one should be bullied by those who confuse brutality with strength. "Not so tough now," one of the bikers muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Another spat on the floor, as if hoping to regain some semblance of dominance. But none of them charged immediately. They tested the air, hesitating, and that hesitation told Henry everything he needed to know. They were not invincible. They were human beings who expected compliance and found themselves confounded by resistance. Henry tightened his grip on the cane and took a slow, deliberate step backward, placing himself in a position where he could see all of them, track any sudden movement. He was no champion fighter, but he could use his surroundings, angle his body, and remain calm while they grew agitated. He would rely on the lessons imprinted in his bones long ago, lessons of survival, courage, and protecting what mattered. He felt the heaviness in his lungs as he inhaled. Each breath reminded him of the life he had lived, the many chapters that had brought him here. He had known hardship, heartbreak, and loss. He had also known duty, honor, and perseverance. In this moment, all of it coalesced into a quiet determination that radiated out through every measured movement. The gang's bravado continued to fade. This was not the swift, simple conquest they craved. Henry stood before them, winded but unwavering, a reminder that age could conceal unexpected resilience. He saw the confusion in their eyes, the cracks forming in their united front. He did not mock them or taunt them. He simply existed before them as living proof that their cruelty did not guarantee victory. Outside, a gust of wind rattled a loose sign, the sound muffled through the diner's panes. Inside, hearts pounded, some from fear, some from hope. Henry's heart beat the loudest in his own ears, but each thump reminded him that he was alive, that he had chosen not to surrender. He had asserted, if only for this moment, that right and dignity could stand against cowardly aggression, and that, as far as he was concerned, was reason enough to keep fighting if they forced his hand further. With the cane poised and his gaze steady, he waited, ready for whatever would come next. Blows and curses flew as the diner became a tense battleground of shifting bodies and desperate lunges. Henry moved methodically, each step calculated to maintain his footing on the slick floor. His breaths were measured, each inhale fueling the strength he needed to remain steady. He wasn't trying to emerge the victor of some grand fight. He wanted only to endure, to outlast this wave of cruelty. He had expected old pains in his joints to slow him, but instead he found that familiarity with adversity helped him focus. His arms rose and fell with precision, parrying a crude swing from one biker before stepping smoothly to the side and delivering a short, controlled strike that caught another thug in the ribs, forcing a startled grunt. His strikes were not wild or fueled by rage. He did not wish to cause lasting harm. Instead, he aimed for the soft spots, an elbow joint, a knee, a shoulder, seeking to inflict pain without cruelty. A cane against human flesh could easily become a weapon of grave damage, but Henry was careful. He had learned long ago that violence, even when necessary, carried a heavy moral price. He used only what force he needed to discourage these men, to hold them at bay until help arrived or they abandoned their twisted game. The clatter of utensils on the floor and the scrape of chairs added a discordant soundtrack to this unexpected fray. The gang's leader locked eyes with Henry, a mixture of shock and anger flickering behind those narrowed lids. This was not going as planned. The old man was supposed to fold like paper, cower and plead. Instead, he had become an immovable presence, each shift of his body revealing a lifetime of resilience. Henry's weathered face bore no triumphant sneer, no mocking grin, just steady resolve. It must have been maddening for a man who thrived on fear and intimidation to confront such unruffled defiance. A few paces behind them, the waitress dared to take action. Henry saw her in the corner of his vision, her face pale but determined as she fumbled for the phone behind the counter. Her hands shook, and he silently willed her to be quick. He noted the tremor in her fingers, the way she glanced nervously at the tangle of bodies. Then, with a trembling breath, she punched in the numbers and lifted the receiver to her ear. Henry didn't know what she said exactly, but her quiet, urgent whisper to the police must have carried the tension of the scene. The gang noticed. Their attention flicked between Henry and the waitress, the sound of her voice a reminder that time was slipping away. They had hoped for a quick display of dominance, scare a few patrons, toy with an old man, then leave feeling invincible. Instead, they found themselves snagged in a predicament. Their victims weren't collapsing in terror, and now the law would soon descend. Panic began to ripple through the gang, a subtle shift in the tilt of their shoulders, the dart of their eyes. A few minutes more, and they might be trapped, forced to explain themselves to officers who wouldn't be impressed by threats or bravado. Sensing their distraction, Henry pressed forward. He advanced in small steps, forcing them back, inch by inch. His strikes were minimal now, sometimes just a faint swing of the cane that made them flinch and retreat. He understood that winning did not mean pummeling them into the ground. It meant breaking their will, making it clear that continuing this confrontation would only worsen their predicament. He breathed steadily, focusing on his center of gravity, recalling old lessons about staying grounded, never overextending, always ready to adapt to a change in momentum. Those watching could hardly believe their eyes. Just moments ago, the diner had been silent with fear, but now a current of hope ran through the room. The customers, though still frightened, could sense that the bikers were off balance. The couple at the counter held their breath, hands clasped together, knuckles white, yet a flicker of admiration danced in their eyes. They saw in Henry not just an old man defending himself, but a living reminder that courage and principles did not crumble with age. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. They had come expecting an easy mark, a quick rush of adrenaline and power. Instead, they had encountered a force they couldn't understand. Henry didn't look like a hero. He was winded, sweat trickling down his neck, his shoulders shaking slightly from exertion. But he stood, unwavering, eyes clear, as if every second under threat reminded him of who he truly was. He was more than just gray hair and creaking bones. He was a veteran who had once stood under the weight of real terror, who had seen uglier faces of violence and survived them. The leader snarled, lifting a fist as if to try one more time, but Henry tapped the floor with his cane, a quiet, confident gesture that caused the man to hesitate. The waitress's voice drifted over the hiss of the kitchen appliances and the ragged breathing of the bikers. Police would be on their way soon, and the gang must have known it. Every second they lingered increased the chance of entrapment. If they stayed, they risked being arrested, forced to explain why they had chosen an old man and a modest diner as their stage for intimidation. Henry watched uncertainty cloud their expressions. He had seen panic before, in enemy soldiers, in frightened recruits, in the faces of those who realized too late they had made a grave mistake. That same realization flickered now in the bikers' eyes. Their bravado, carefully constructed from leather jackets and snarling patches, was dissolving. They understood that they couldn't back down without looking weak to each other. Yet, continuing was no better. Some cut nervous glances toward the door, as if gauging how quickly they could bolt. Others shifted their weight from foot to foot, uncertain who should move first. Henry stepped forward once more, cane raised slightly, showing them he would push if he had to. He hoped they would take the chance to run, to end this without further harm. He had no desire to see them locked in a humiliating fight that might lead to broken bones or worse. The point was made. He would not be their victim. Age had not stolen his will. Kindness had not made him weak. A thin sheen of sweat coated his brow, but inside he felt a curious calm. He was not a young soldier anymore, bracing for death. He was an old man who understood that sometimes a single stand could echo through countless ordinary lives, showing that decency was worth defending. He knew these bikers would remember this day, not fondly, but as a lesson they hadn't asked for. Maybe that lesson would stick with them. Maybe not, but he had given them a truth they could not unsee. Panic truly flickered in their eyes now. Fear of consequences, fear of looking foolish, fear of what came next. The leader pressed his lips together, knuckles pale as he balled his hands into fists, and then let them relax again. He cast a glance at his men, then at the doorway, and finally back at Henry. In that gaze, Henry read a reluctant respect. Behind them, distant sirens wailed, faint but approaching. The waitress's voice, though still hushed, must have conveyed enough urgency to stir the police into action. The bikers understood. Their window was closing. They had wanted to break a man, to carve fear into a quiet afternoon. Instead, they stood before a figure who stood for something they could not easily dismiss. Henry saw them waver, saw their bravado collapse in the face of calm defiance. He held his ground, breathing steadily, letting them see that he was ready if they dared to try again. And in that charged silence, he waited for them to make the only sensible choice left. The roar of distant sirens grew steadily louder, each wail drawing closer and pressing against the tension lingering in the diner's stale air. Henry felt the vibrations in his chest, as if the sound itself had weight. He stood tall, breathing heavily, heart pounding, but still in control. The cane remained in his hand, its smooth surface warm from his grip. He surveyed the scene before him without gloating, without triumph. He was alive, and the threat was fading. One of the bikers, a sullen figure nursing a bruised forearm, hobbled toward a window, lifting the corner of a blind to peer out. His muttered curses floated through the silence. He saw what Henry already suspected. The authorities were closing in, summoned by the quiet courage of the waitress who had dared to make that call. The man's eyes darted nervously, and he barked a warning over his shoulder to his companions. They had been so sure of themselves moments ago, men who waltzed in expecting docility and fear. Now their bravado faltered, each new shriek of the siren eroding the thin veneer of power they'd brandished. Henry kept his silence. He allowed them to feel the weight of this moment. He saw their leader snarl, baring his teeth like a cornered animal. The leader's gaze flicked between Henry and the door, calculating odds that had soured. Their victim had turned out to be anything but helpless. The old man with the cane had refused to crumble, refused to let cruelty dictate the narrative. Now, with help rushing closer, the leader's window of intimidation had slammed shut. He made a sharp gesture with his hand, a silent command to retreat, as though acknowledging that no performance of dominance could continue under these conditions. The gang began to back away, step by reluctant step, as if hoping to reclaim some shred of dignity by not outright fleeing. Each backward step knocked something askew. A chair leg scraping over linoleum, a plate skittering across the floor and coming to rest near a spilled napkin. They left chaos behind, a physical echo of their presence. Henry watched them carefully, cane still raised in a posture that said, "Do not try again." His lungs burned slightly from exertion. He inhaled slowly, drawing air deep into his chest, letting his heart settle. In that moment, Henry felt neither pride nor bitterness, only relief and a solemn understanding of how fragile peace could be. He had not wanted this confrontation, would have preferred to finish his coffee and pie in anonymity, Yet fate had chosen otherwise, setting him as a bulwark between malice and innocence. The idea weighed on him. He knew that once the bikers were gone, he would be left with a swirl of emotions to untangle. Still, he gave no outward sign of uncertainty. The world had seen too much fear and too little resolve. At least now these thugs would carry a memory that not everyone rolled over under threat. Behind him, relieved whispers rippled through the diner. The couple at the counter murmured softly, voices quivering but filling the silence left by retreat. A traveling salesman who had been huddled near the restroom door coughed quietly, as if reminding himself he could speak again. The waitress, still clutching the phone, dared to step forward once the gang had cleared a path, her eyes shining with residual terror and gratitude. The tension drained from the room, replaced by the delicate hush that follows a storm's passing. Henry lowered the cane by slow degrees, careful not to appear reckless. He relaxed his shoulders, allowed his spine to uncoil from the rigidity of combat readiness. Each muscle protested the sudden slackening, and he realized how tightly wound he had been. The ache in his joints returned, a reminder that heroism, if one could call it that, carried a physical cost at his age. He clenched and unclenched his fingers around the cane's handle, the warmth in his palms fading as the immediate threat receded. He couldn't help but reflect. This battle had not been one of choice, but of necessity. He had stood up because standing down would have meant condoning cruelty through silence. He had brandished that cane, not to prove strength, but to insist that decency mattered. The bikers had confronted him with raw intimidation, and he had responded with quiet defiance. He had shown them that brutality could be challenged, that morality and courage could outlast the shrill posturing of bullies. The sirens howled closer now, their cry reverberating through the dusty parking lot outside. Henry imagined the police cars pulling in, uniformed officers stepping out onto gravel, scanning for a threat. They would find shattered mugs, overturned chairs, shaken patrons, but no helpless victims, no easy narrative of predators and prey. They would find an old man with a cane who had held a line. It did not make him feel grand or heroic. He was too old, too honest with himself to revel in such labels. He felt simply that he had done what he could. That was enough. He turned slightly, meeting the gaze of a woman who had crouched behind a booth during the chaos. She managed a tentative smile, relief and respect mingling on her face. He offered a small, acknowledging nod. Each relieved whisper in that room, each hesitant smile, told him his effort had not been in vain. He had preserved something intangible: dignity, safety, a fragile sense that justice could surface even in unexpected places. Outside, the rumble of engines and the crunch of tires signaled the arrival of help. The gang was gone, or at least in the process of leaving, vanishing like a bad dream at sunrise. Henry allowed himself a moment to breathe, really breathe, to taste the aftermath. He thought of the fields he had once stood in, the distant orders barked over static-laced radios, the friends he had lost. All those experiences had shaped him, given him the resilience to face down these men today. He had not let age render him powerless. Another patron timidly thanked him, voice low but sincere. Henry turned to the speaker, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who had clutched his jacket tightly through the ordeal. Henry responded with a gentle incline of his head. Words felt unnecessary. The silence that filled the diner now was not tense. It was charged with awe and gratitude. He could hear someone in the kitchen banging a pot, perhaps to steady themselves with the familiar rattle of daily work. The sun still shone through the dusty blinds, painting streaks of golden light on the tiled floor, as if no violence had occurred. Yet everyone in that room knew the truth. Something had happened here. Something that would be remembered. He stepped forward, leaning a bit on the cane now, allowing it to serve its original purpose. He had no illusions that he was unscathed. His heart still pounded, his muscles trembled lightly, and he could almost feel the hours that would come when his body would ache fiercely, reminding him he was not young. But he would bear that pain without complaint. This day had demanded courage, and he had answered. It was the quiet price of facing down cruelty. As the sirens reached their crescendo outside, Henry took one more sweeping glance around the diner. The place looked disheveled. Chairs askew, coffee mugs shattered, plates scattered like debris after a storm. But the people were intact, alive, and safe. No one had fallen victim to the gang's brutality. No one lay bleeding in the aftermath of a hopeless struggle. For this he was immensely grateful. He closed his eyes for a breath, centering himself, feeling the warmth of the sun and the lingering tension fade. Soon the police would enter, ask questions, record statements. The tale of an old man who stood his ground would slip into local lore. Maybe the bikers would think twice before harassing someone again. Or maybe not. Henry could not control that. He had done what he could, and that was enough. When he opened his eyes again, he found that the fear and hostility had seeped out of the room, replaced by a tentative calm. He listened to the distant sirens, no longer a threat but a promise that order would be restored. In that quiet acceptance, Henry knew he had done right. He had shown them, and perhaps reminded himself, that age and kindness did not equate to weakness, and that true strength could be found in the simple act of standing firm against cruelty. The door swung open, creaking on its hinges, and the bikers staggered into the glare of the afternoon sun. Their departure was not graceful. Some jostled one another, cursing under their breath as they hurried to reach their motorcycles. Engines coughed and then roared to life, the piercing growl of machinery blending with the distant wail of approaching sirens. They tore out of the parking lot, kicking up small stones and dust, desperate to outrun the consequence of their cruelty and the memory of an old man who had stood unexpectedly firm. Inside the diner, it felt as though a held breath had finally been released. Customers who had huddled behind booths or crouched low in their seats now began to stir. A few cleared their throats, embarrassed perhaps by their earlier silence, yet relieved that the threat had passed. The waitress leaned heavily against the counter, pressing a hand to her chest as tears welled in her eyes. Her earlier terror was melting into something like gratitude and disbelief. Henry watched this unfold with a quiet, steady gaze. He allowed himself a moment to acknowledge the ache settling into his bones, the consequence of sudden exertion and tension clamped too long in his muscles. His limbs felt heavier now that the adrenaline was ebbing, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue. Still, he made sure to stand tall, shoulders back, as he slipped the cane, a borrowed ally in this strange conflict, back to its spot by the wall. He adjusted his collar, straightening his shirt as if to restore a sense of normalcy. He had faced down young men half a century younger with nothing but resolve, and now he sought to restore the quiet dignity he had carried into this diner. The sirens were closer now, their keening a reminder that the world beyond this small establishment was still in motion. Soon the police would arrive, expecting chaos, perhaps victims and a crime scene. Instead, they would find only the scattered debris of a thwarted attempt at intimidation, Chairs knocked askew, shattered mugs, plates lying like wounded soldiers on the linoleum floor. The criminals had fled, and the old man they had hoped to break had refused to yield. Customers rose slowly, approaching Henry with hesitant steps. Their faces were studies in relief and admiration. The couple that had been huddled at the counter now ventured closer, the man clearing his throat, before speaking in a voice still a bit shaky. "Thank you," he said softly, as if unsure the word was big enough for the moment. The woman beside him nodded, eyes shining. Another patron, a traveling salesman, judging by the dusty suitcase at his feet, dipped his head in silent respect. Others murmured similar sentiments, gratitude, astonishment, and a kind of quiet awe that something good had prevailed here. Henry's heart was still beating harder than usual. He could feel every thump as a gentle reminder that he was alive, that he had done what he must. Yet he also felt a distinct humility, a sense that he had not performed some grand heroic deed, but rather had done what any decent person should do when confronted with cruelty. He offered the customers a small, humble nod, acknowledging their words without basking in them. He was not comfortable being cast as a hero. He understood that courage often wore no cape, carried no banner. It was simply doing what needed to be done. In the lingering hush, the waitress pushed away from the counter and approached, her steps tentative. She still held the phone in one hand, though now only a dull dial tone crackled from the receiver. With trembling effort, she set it down. "They're on their way," she said, voice hushed. "Are you all right?" Her eyes searched Henry's face, looking for signs of injury or pain. She looked younger now, relieved and caring. He managed a faint smile and told her he was fine. The tears that had threatened moments before slipped free, rolling silently down her cheeks. Without words, Henry understood what she meant to convey. Gratitude for his defense, admiration for the unexpected strength he had summoned, sorrow that it had been necessary at all. The diner felt changed, as if a part of its innocence had been tested and preserved. The scattered debris bore witness to the conflict, yet the people remained unhurt. Henry took that as a quiet victory. He had not wanted violence, he never would, but he had refused to let brutality define this moment. In the eyes of those around him, he saw something he recognized from long ago. Relief that there were still people in the world who stood against cruelty, who refused to accept it as inevitable. As the sirens swelled outside, Henry could imagine the police cars pulling up. Soon officers would step inside, note the shaken customers and the disarray. They might look at Henry, see only an elderly gentleman, and wonder how he fit into the story. The customers would explain, perhaps embellishing details in their excitement, speaking of how the old man defied a gang of bikers. Henry did not care for how the tale might be told. He cared only that people understood cruelty could be met with resolve, that standing firm required no special title, no particular youth or strength, only the will to do what conscience demanded. One of the patrons, a middle-aged woman wearing a floral scarf, approached shyly. She managed a quiet thank you as well. Henry responded with a gentle nod, acknowledging her sincerity. He could see in her eyes that she would remember this day for a long time. Perhaps she would tell friends or family about the afternoon a quiet diner was nearly overshadowed by violence, until an old man reminded everyone that wrong could be resisted. He heard faint footsteps outside, the crunch of gravel under tires as the sirens peaked and then softened, cars halting near the diner's entrance. Soon, uniforms would fill the doorway, questions asked, statements taken. Henry sighed softly, bracing himself for the next stage of this unexpected event. There would be explanations to give, and he would provide them, though he suspected his role would be downplayed by his own modesty. He wanted no medals, no headlines. He would tell the truth simply, that he had refused to back down and the bikers had fled. As he waited for the door to open and the officers to enter, Henry glanced around at the people who shared this moment. He saw the waitress, wiping her tears and straightening her apron, as if trying to regain some professionalism. The couple from the counter hovered nearby, holding hands more tightly now, relieved that they could still do so. The salesman stood by his suitcase, shoulders relaxed, as though he had been preparing to intervene in some small way, but never dared. All of them had been tested, and together they had persevered. Outside, a breeze stirred the dust in the parking lot, carrying away the harsh memory of revving engines and shouted threats. In its wake remained a diner that would never look quite the same to these people. Henry understood that this place, these faces, had seen something rare, the refusal of an ordinary man to yield to bullies. He hoped the memory might inspire them, might remind them that goodness was not an illusion, and that one person could shift the balance when others faltered. He felt the ache in his shoulders again. Age had not made him powerless, but it had made such efforts costly. He accepted that cost. It was enough to see the relieved smiles, the easing of tension, the return of quiet voices filling the space once filled by shouted threats. He offered one more nod, more to himself than anyone else, acknowledging that he had done what was needed. In their eyes he saw respect and relief, a reaffirmation that good people existed in this world. He was content with that. Let the police come and go. Let the day wear on into evening. He stood by his principles and refused to let cruelty win. That was all the reward he needed. Henry took a seat again, feeling the slow drain of adrenaline that had coursed through him just moments before. Now, with the immediate threat gone and the bikers scattered into the afternoon's glare, he allowed his body to relax. His shoulders sagged slightly, each breath a reminder of the tension he had carried. He felt a dull ache settle into his muscles, an echo of the effort he had exerted. He was not young, and his body made sure he would not forget that fact. Still, he was upright, intact, and breathing. That was enough. The waitress approached quietly, her steps tentative yet determined. She was still trembling a bit, as if her body had not caught up with the reality that the danger had passed. She placed a fresh cup of coffee before him, the steam rising in gentle curls that caught the overhead lights. "On the house," she said, voice low and warm, as if she feared speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile calm. Her eyes were red at the corners, tears of relief not fully dry, yet her gaze shone with gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that he had protected not just himself, but everyone here. He cupped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth that seeped into his palms. The aroma of coffee brought him back to calmer days, mornings reading the newspaper, quiet afternoons spent with old friends who had also seen too much, and yet retained their dignity. He took a careful sip, letting the dark, bitter taste ground him in the present. There was no need for hurry now, no reason to stand guard. Outside, squad cars drew closer, sirens rising and falling in urgent waves. Soon, uniformed officers would fill the doorway, ask questions, take statements. There would be explanations, some confusion, and a final resolution that might never make headlines. To the world, this would be a minor incident. To those inside the diner, it would remain a vivid memory. An intrusion of violence repelled by the unexpected resilience of an old man. Henry glanced around. The diner's occupants were no longer rooted in fear, but they moved slowly, as if recovering from a bad dream. The couple at the counter offered him a nod of thanks, their eyes still wide with disbelief. They had witnessed something they never expected to see, a quiet confrontation where morals and courage prevailed. He nodded back, a gentle acknowledgement, aware that words might feel insufficient. Some experiences spoke for themselves. Scattered dishes lay on the floor, shattered mugs and plates bearing witness to the conflict. The air held a faint odor of spilled coffee and sweat. A few customers knelt to help the waitress gather broken pieces of ceramic, as if cleaning up might restore a sense of normalcy. Henry understood that this moment would linger in everyone's mind. The tension, the fear, the sudden reversal of power. They would think of it in the days to come, recalling how an afternoon meal turned into a scene of fragile heroism. He took another sip of coffee and let his thoughts drift. He remembered that once upon a time he fought for these values: dignity, justice, the right to live without fear, on foreign soil. He had been so young then, barely more than a boy, thrust into landscapes where enemies hid in the dark, and survival meant holding fast to a higher purpose. In those days, he believed that by facing down tyranny abroad, he helped secure a safer future at home. Today, he had fought for them here, in a quiet diner under a hot sun, defending them not with rifles and platoons, but with calm resolve and an old cane pressed into unexpected service. He understood a hard truth now. The world still needed such stands against cruelty. It pained him that this necessity persisted. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that time and progress would lessen humanity's inclination toward bullying and brutality. Yet here was living proof that people could still walk into a peaceful place and attempt to dominate others through fear. He had his method, right? He was doing the right thing. He was exercising his own rationality. He felt no regret for his actions. He had done what was right. But a gentle sorrow settled within him, like a quiet weight. The fact that he, at his age, had to intervene spoke volumes about the stubborn persistence of darkness in human hearts. Outside, the squad cars arrived. He could see through the window as their lights swirled in vivid colors against the dusty parking lot. He watched officers step out, scanning the area with practiced eyes, noting the abrupt absence of the bikers. They would come inside soon, and there would be questions. He imagined how the conversation would go. He would offer a calm, straightforward account. He would not embellish or seek praise. He would simply explain that these men had come seeking an easy target, and he had refused to be one. The others would tell their own versions of the story, how the old man stood firm, how the waitress managed to make a call for help while the gang was distracted, how no one had been seriously hurt. Over time, details might blur, but the essence would remain. Faced with intimidation, the diners had not been left defenseless. Henry had reminded them that courage did not have an expiration date, that principles did not diminish with time. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the tenderness in his joints. He hoped that maybe this confrontation would leave some imprint on the bikers as well. Perhaps one day, when they recalled how an elderly man had defied them, they might question their actions, wonder why their bravado crumbled against simple moral conviction. Or perhaps not. He knew he could not control the lessons others took from this event, and also, but who controls how a person thinks? Hence the possibilities for insanity. A soft murmur rippled through the diner as a pair of officers stepped in, their presence grounding everyone further in the aftermath. They wore serious expressions, already scanning faces and taking in the overturned chairs and broken crockery. Henry expected they would approach him soon. He raised his coffee cup, took another slow sip, savoring the warmth and bitterness. He would answer their questions politely without fanfare. In his mind, there was no heroism here, only necessity. He had done what needed doing. The waitress hovered near him, still shaken but calmer now. Her gratitude was obvious in the way she kept glancing at him, trying to find words. "If you need anything," she managed quietly, voice catching slightly, "just let me know." He gave her a kind smile, appreciating her thoughtfulness. He knew she had been as frightened as anyone, but she had played her part, too, calling the police despite her trembling hands. Courage wore many faces. He thought of the couple at the counter once more. They stood close together, holding hands as if reasserting their bond after such a scare. He thought of the traveling salesman who had peeked from behind a pillar and now busied himself retrieving his briefcase from the floor, looking mildly embarrassed that he hadn't intervened. Henry felt no blame toward them. Not everyone was equipped to stand up in a crisis. He understood that his lifetime of experience had given him certain tools others lacked. In the distant recesses of his mind, images of old battlefields flickered. The clink of gear, the shouts of commanding officers, the silent prayers whispered under starless skies. He had imagined that after coming home, after living a long, peaceful life, he would never again be called upon to show that kind of resolve. Yet, life had ways of surprising him. He had defended strangers in a small diner because it was the right thing to do. Perhaps that was enough meaning to extract from this moment. He watched the officers as they began to speak to the waitress, noting how carefully she pointed out the direction in which the bikers fled. Henry didn't interrupt. He would wait his turn, drink his coffee, and gather his breath. The ache in his bones reminded him that he was no longer young, but youth alone did not define one's capacity for courage. The world could still rely on people who, even in their final decades, chose kindness and principle over indifference. A gentle sadness still clung to him, the sadness that the world required such stands. But he recognized, too, that in facing down cruelty, he reaffirmed the values he once fought to protect. He saw it in the grateful smiles, the whispered thank yous, and the way the waitress's tear-bright eyes softened when she looked at him. These quiet acknowledgments told him he had not stood in vain. He would carry that truth home with him when he left, as real and comforting as the warmth of the coffee in his hands. He took another sip, letting the taste linger on his tongue. There was no regret in what he had done, only acceptance of reality. That sometimes, even long after one thought their battles were done, the world presented a moment that demanded courage. He had answered that demand without hesitation. It would not change the world entirely, but it had changed this moment for everyone here, setting an example that cruelty could be faced and turned away, and for Henry, that was reason enough. As the police officers stepped inside, their uniforms crisp against the fading light and their voices calm, Henry realized the diner had transformed from a place of fear into one of quiet healing. A few customers stood off to the side, offering halting explanations of what had happened, their words still tinged with disbelief. He finished his coffee, savoring the last bitter sip. The warmth that pooled in his belly helped steady him, reminding him that he was very much alive, that he had not merely survived this encounter, but emerged with his dignity intact. He rose from his seat, feeling the gentle protest of his muscles and bones, as if they were curious why he had asked so much of them at his age. He allowed himself a rueful smile. His body might ache, but that was a small price to pay for defending what was right. He had not sought violence, and yet, when cornered, he had stood firm. That knowledge hummed quietly inside him, more steady than the coffee had been. It told him that he had not lost himself to time's slow erosion. He remained who he had always been at heart, a man who understood that one must protect what is precious and just. The officers moved methodically, taking notes, asking questions. One of them caught Henry's eye and nodded respectfully, as though acknowledging that, before their arrival, something important had taken place. Henry did not need their praise. He offered a small nod in return, conveying that he was fine, that the matter was settled. If they needed a statement, he would give it quietly, without flourish. He had no appetite for grand retellings or claims of heroism. He had only done what the situation demanded. Drained, but calm, Henry turned toward the door. The smell of coffee and cleaning solution lingered in the air, mingling with the lingering tension that had yet to fully dissipate. People stepped aside as he passed, some offering him nods, a few murmuring quiet thank yous. The waitress, who had bravely called the police while stifling her fear, stood near the register, a damp cloth in her hand. She glanced up as he approached, a damp cloth in her hand. "Take care," she said softly, voice sincere. There was relief and gratitude there, a kind of subdued reverence that made Henry shift slightly, embarrassed by such open admiration. He responded with a gentle smile, a tilt of his head. He hoped she understood that he respected her courage too, the courage to seek help when fear might have paralyzed her. It was a quiet solidarity between them. As Henry stepped out, the dusk met him with a soft embrace. The sky was painted with rose and gold streaks, the sun dipping low behind distant hills. The parking lot's dust swirled in a faint breeze, carrying away the scent of exhaust fumes left behind by the fleeing bikers. He paused beneath the diner's sign, a cornerstone that would soon glow against the encroaching darkness. The sign bore a familiar name, one he had seen many times over the years driving through these parts. Tonight, though, it felt different, as if bearing witness to what had just occurred. In that still moment, Henry breathed in the dry air, letting it cleanse the lingering tension from his mind. Today had been a test he had never anticipated. A test of resolve, of principles he had once fought to preserve in lands far from here. Decades ago, wearing a young man's uniform, he had learned that courage was not absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Back then, bullets whizzed overhead and the stakes were life and death. Today, in a dusty parking lot, he faced bullies rather than soldiers, cruelty rather than organized aggression. Yet the lesson remained the same. One must stand when it matters, regardless of age or odds. He reminded himself that age had not stripped him of the will to do what was right. The years had slowed his stride, etched lines in his face and grayed his hair, but they had not taken from him the essence of who he was. He might be old, but he was still capable of defending what mattered. As he stood there, in the lengthening shadows, Henry understood this with a quiet certainty. Courage had no age limit, neither did kindness or the resolve to stand up for the vulnerable. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the distant murmur of voices inside the diner. Laughter, relieved, shaky laughter, drifted through the open door. The customers were recovering from their ordeal, reassembling their sense of normalcy amid the chaos. Chairs would be set upright, pieces of broken dishes swept away, and life would go on. Yet, something had changed. A subtle legacy lingered. The memory that cruelty had been confronted and pushed back, not by youthful might or modern bravado, but by a quiet old man who refused to yield. His car waited at the far end of the lot, paint faded from years of sun and travel. Each step Henry took was deliberate. His joints reminded him that every action had a cost, and he accepted that cost without complaint. As he approached the vehicle, he let his gaze wander over the landscape. The dusty fields, the wavering heat lines on the horizon. It looked the same as it always had, Yet he now carried a new story within him. He had proven to himself, and to anyone who cared to notice, that justice and honor did not depend on youth or muscle. They depended on the willingness to act, to stand one's ground when it counted. He opened the car door slowly, the hinges creaking faintly. Before settling into the driver's seat, he took one last glance toward the diner. The voices inside had calmed to a low hum of conversation and aftershock. The police would handle the rest, gleaning details, and perhaps one day catching the bikers. Henry hoped those men would think long and hard about what had happened here, that maybe this incident would plant a seed of doubt in their cruelty. Henry hoped when this hold on the listening a voice with greater gossip of mind, something his mind had already heard several times before. He understood he could not force that growth, but it was a hope he allowed himself nonetheless. Sliding into the seat, he felt the leather cushion yield beneath him. He ran a hand over the steering wheel, recalling a younger version of himself who never imagined he would face another confrontation that tested his mettle. Life held surprises at every turn. He had passed today's test not through grand heroism, but through steadfastness and principle. He had shown that to be strong did not mean to dominate. It meant to uphold what was right, even when it was hard. He started the engine. It coughed a little before settling into a steady purr. As he pulled out of the parking lot, dust rose behind him in a gentle cloud. The sun had dipped further, stretching the shadows long and thin across the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the diner's sign glowing faintly as twilight set in. He had left a subtle legacy behind, an example of honor, dignity, and unshakable truth. Justice could prevail if someone dared to stand. Even an old veteran, weighed down by years and memories, could show that kindness and courage still mattered. He smiled to himself, a quiet, inward smile, as he merged onto the lonely road. The hum of the engine and the fading light kept him company, bearing him forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. He had done enough today. He had shown that age did not diminish the human spirit, that one could still protect and inspire without trading principles for safety. As he drove, the distant laughter and fading echoes of revving engines sank into memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. He carried on, sure in the knowledge that he had acted rightly, that he had reasserted values more enduring than fear. In this knowledge he found comfort, letting the dusk envelop him as he continued onward, grateful for the chance to remember and reaffirm who he was and what he stood for.